The day Emma Whitaker rode into Caldwell, Kansas. The summer of 1882 was burning so hot that the dust rising from the main street looked like steam off a kettle. And every soul in that town would later swear they felt something shift the moment her wagon wheels cut through that fine red grit and stopped in front of the Silver Bell Saloon. She was 26 years old, which was older than most people expected of a woman arriving alone in a cattle town with nothing but a single trunk strapped to the back of a borrowed wagon, and a set of eyes the color of creek water after a heavy rain. She was not beautiful in the way that saloon paintings tried to make women beautiful, all soft edges and willing smiles. She was beautiful in the way that weather was beautiful, in the way that a sky going dark before a storm was beautiful, fierce and real, and impossible to look away from. The wagon belonged to old Hector Prout, who ran the feed store 2 towns east in Wellington, and who had agreed to bring her as far as Caldwell in exchange for the last of her coins. She climbed down from that wagon seat without help, thanked Hector with a nod that carried more dignity than most people managed with a full speech, and stood in the middle of Caldwell's main thoroughfare looking at what her future had handed her. It was not much to look at. Caldwell in the summer of 1882 sat at the southern edge of Kansas, practically breathing down the neck of Indian Territory. And it was the kind of town that existed because cattle existed, and cattle existed because the men who drove them north from Texas had to stop somewhere. The Kishom Trail ended here, more or less, and that meant Caldwell was loud and dusty and permanently smelling of livestock and tobacco, and the particular sour odor of men who had been riding for weeks without a proper wash. There were saloons and gambling houses, and a church that looked slightly embarrassed to be standing between them. There was a sheriff's office with a broken front step that nobody had gotten around to fixing. There was a general store, a livery stable, a barber, and a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Calloway, who rented rooms to women of good reputation and judged the reputation at the door. Emma Whitaker walked directly to Mrs. Calloway's boarding house because she had written ahead and paid 2 weeks' board in advance with the last of the money her mother had pressed into her hands before she left Missouri. Her mother had been crying. Emma had not. She had learned, somewhere in the previous 3 years, how to stop crying at the things she could not change, and the list of things she could not change had grown very long indeed. The room Mrs. Calloway gave her was small and faced east, which meant it was unbearably hot by noon and mercifully cool by evening. It had a narrow bed with a quilted coverlet that smelled of cedar and old lavender, a washstand with a cracked pitcher, and a single window that looked out over the alley where the livery stable boys played cards when they thought nobody was watching. Emma set her trunk at the foot of the bed, sat down on the edge of the mattress, and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to feel the full weight of everything she had left behind and everything she was uncertain about. Then she stood up, splashed water from the cracked pitcher on her face, smoothed her dark hair back, and went downstairs to ask Mrs. Calloway where a woman might find work in Caldwell that did not require her to pour whiskey or pretend to enjoy the company of trail riders. Mrs. Calloway looked at her over the rims of her reading spectacles and said the general store was looking for someone to help with accounts, since the owner's wife had taken ill the previous spring and the books had gotten into a state. She said the name of the owner was Mr. Briggs, and she said it with the particular tone women use to communicate that a man is difficult without quite saying so out loud. Emma thanked her, went to bed without supper because she was too tired to eat, and in the morning she put on her second-best dress and her one good pair of boots and went to speak to Mr. Briggs about his books. She got the job. Mr. Briggs was indeed difficult, in the way that anxious men who do not like to admit they need help are difficult, but Emma had dealt with more difficult men than him, and she knew how to make a person feel that hiring her was their own idea. She started that same morning, seated at a small table in the back corner of the general store, surrounded by ledger books that had not seen order in the better part of 18 months, and she set to work. It was good work, the kind that asked nothing of her except her mind and her patience, and Emma had both of those in abundance. She worked through the mornings and the early afternoons, and in the late afternoons when the store grew quiet, she would take a walk through Caldwell and study the shape of the place, learning its rhythms the way you learn any landscape, where the trouble gathered, where the quiet lived, which faces could be trusted, and which ones looked at you like they were calculating something. She had been in Caldwell for 9 days when she first saw Noah Monroe. She was not looking for anyone. She had specifically, deliberately, in the deep private chambers of her own heart, decided she was not looking for anyone, not after what had happened in Missouri, not after the 3 years of grief she had carried out of St. Joseph like a stone in her chest that would not dissolve no matter how much she walked or worked or refused to let herself cry about it. She was in Caldwell to build something small and manageable and hers. She was not looking for anyone, but she saw him. He was sitting alone at a table in the Silver Bell Saloon. She knew this because the Silver Bell had a wide front window, and Emma was walking past on her way back from the general store on an afternoon that had gone orange with dust and heat, and she glanced through that window the way you glance through any window when the light inside is warmer than the light outside, and there is movement to catch your eye. He was not moving. That was what caught her eye, actually. Every other man in that saloon was in motion, playing cards or arguing or drinking in that emphatic way that trail riders drink after weeks of nothing. But this man was utterly still. He was sitting at a table in the corner, not the corner nearest the bar, not the corner nearest the door, but the back corner, the one where the shadows collected thickest, and he had a cup of coffee in front of him, and he was staring at nothing. He was somewhere in his early 30s, she guessed, with the look of a man who had spent most of those years outdoors. He was broad-shouldered in the way that came from real work and not from intention, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that carried the particular set of a man who had made a habit of not speaking when he could help it. He wore a plain cotton shirt, dark with the heat, and a hat he had not bothered to take off even indoors. There was a Colt revolver on his hip in a plain leather holster, nothing fancy, the kind of gun a working man carries and hopes never to use. He was the most alone-looking person Emma Whitaker had ever seen in her life. And she would later admit to herself with some embarrassment, seen her own face in enough mirrors to know what alone looked like on a person. She walked on. She went back to Mrs. Calloway's, washed her face, helped set the supper table because Mrs. Calloway appreciated the help, and ate a decent meal with 2 other boarders, a schoolteacher named Miss Potts who talked about her students with the hopeless devotion of someone who knows she is fighting a losing battle, and a seamstress named Clara whose husband was somewhere in Texas, doing something that Clara described only as business and did not elaborate on. Emma listened to both of them and asked questions and was good company, and later that night she lay in her narrow bed staring at the ceiling and thinking, against her better judgment, about the man in the corner of the Silver Bell. She did not know his name yet. She did not know that his name was Noah Monroe, that he had been born in Tennessee in 1850 and come west at the age of 19 with 2 other men, and a dream of cattle ranching that had gradually, over the years, turned into something quieter and more solitary than he had planned. She did not know that he had owned a small spread 10 miles south of Caldwell called the Monroe Place, nothing grand, 160 acres and a decent herd, the kind of operation that did not make a man rich but kept him steady. She did not know that he had been married once, to a woman named Ruth, and that Ruth had died in the winter of 1878 from a fever that started as something small and became something that 4 days could not contain. She did not know that after Ruth died, Noah Monroe had grown very quiet in the way that certain losses make certain people quiet, not broken exactly, not visibly in pieces, but sealed over like a wound that heals on the outside while something persists beneath. She did not know that in 4 years of living alone on that spread, working his cattle with a hired hand named Pete Vasquez, and riding into Caldwell once or twice a week for supplies or to sit in the Silver Bell with a cup of coffee, because the silence of the ranch house had a quality in the evenings that he could not always bear. Noah Monroe had stopped asking questions that mattered. The small questions he still managed. He could ask Pete about the fence line, and ask Mr. Briggs about feed prices, and ask the bartender at the Silver Bell, a good-natured man named Walt, whether there had been any trouble in town lately. He asked those things because they were required, and because they kept the world operational. But the deeper questions, the ones that required genuine curiosity about another person, the kind of questions that said, "I want to know who you are," the kind that built something between two people, those had gone quiet in him somewhere around 1879, and by 1882 they were so deeply buried that on most days he did not even notice their absence. He noticed other absences more keenly. He noticed the absence of sound in the evenings, the specific domestic sound of another person moving through the same house, the creak of someone else's chair, the small noise of someone turning pages, the sound of another person's breathing in the dark. He noticed the absence of being known. Pete Vasquez was a good man and a fair enough hand, and they got along well enough in the way of men who work side by side without needing to talk much. But Pete did not know him, and Noah did not know Pete, not really, and that particular kind of loneliness was different from the loudness of grief. It was quieter and more persistent. It was the kind of loneliness you could almost talk yourself out of believing you had. Emma Whitaker learned all of this gradually, in pieces, over the weeks that followed, because Emma Whitaker was a woman who noticed things and who was not afraid of the information that noticing gave her, and also because the world of a small cattle town in Kansas in 1882 was a small world where the same people occupied the same spaces, and sooner or later everyone's story became common knowledge. She learned his name first, from Walt the bartender, on the day she went into the Silver Bell to ask Walt if he knew of anyone in town who needed accounting help in the evenings, since her hours at Briggs's store ended at 3, and she had time and energy to spare. Walt was the kind of man who knew everyone in Caldwell and was happy to tell you about them, and while he was thinking about who might need accounting help, he mentioned almost in passing that the quiet fellow in the back corner was Noah Monroe, who ran cattle south of town, and had since his wife passed, poor man, and kept mostly to himself. Emma looked at the quiet fellow in the back corner. He was reading the Caldwell commercial, or holding it in front of him in the way of reading, though from where she stood she could see his eyes were not moving across the page. "He looks like a man thinking something over," she said to Walt, mostly to herself. "He looks like that every time he comes in," Walt said without much sentiment. "Been looking like that for a while. Good man, though, never causes trouble, tips fair." Emma noted this. She noted the name Noah Monroe. She went back to Mrs. Calloway's and helped set the supper table, and that night, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she fell asleep thinking about someone other than herself. The day she sat down at his table arrived, as significant days always do, without announcing itself. It was a Thursday in late July, and the heat had reached the kind of intensity that made Caldwell feel like the town was being held against an iron skillet. Emma had finished her work at Briggs's store early because the afternoon had driven even the most determined shoppers indoors, and she had walked past the Silver Bell on her way home, and then, almost before she had consciously decided to do it, she had pushed open the door and walked inside. The saloon was quieter than usual. 2 men were playing cards at a table near the bar. Walt was wiping glasses behind the counter. The piano player who came on weekend evenings was not there, and in the back corner, as was apparently his habit on Thursday afternoons, Noah Monroe sat alone with a cup of coffee and the particular quality of stillness that Emma had now observed through the window enough times to find herself thinking about it in quiet moments. She walked directly to his table. She did not do it shyly. Emma Whitaker had learned, through the specific education of difficulty, That hesitation was often more frightening than the thing you were hesitating about. She walked to his table, pulled out the chair across from him, and sat down. He looked up at her with the expression of a man who was not certain what had just happened. His eyes were dark, the color of strong coffee, and they had the quality of eyes that had seen a good deal and grown careful about what they let in. He looked at her, and he did not say anything, which was not rudeness, she sensed, but a genuine pause, the pause of someone who had been so far away in his own thoughts that the world coming back to him required a moment. "I am not going to ask if this seat is taken," Emma said, settling her skirt and placing her hands on the table with the composure of a woman who was less composed inside than she appeared, "because it is clearly not taken, and I believe we would both find that exchange tiresome." He looked at her for another moment. Then something at the corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile but the ghost of one, the memory of one, and he said, "All right." "My name is Emma Whitaker," she said. "I have been working at Briggs's store for just under 2 weeks. I have been in Caldwell for 11 days. I grew up in Missouri. I am 26 years old. I am not looking for trouble, and I am not looking for anything in particular." She paused. "I say that last part because I imagine it is easier for both of us if I am direct about it." He was quiet for a moment longer. Then he said, "Noah Monroe." "I know," she said. "Walt told me." Something about this seemed to surprise him slightly. "Walt told you my name. Walt is forthcoming. He also told me you have cattle south of town and that you have been coming in here for the better part of 4 years." She looked at the coffee cup in front of him. "And that you drink coffee instead of whiskey, which I find sensible." "It is sensible," he agreed. Walt appeared at the table without being called, the particular intuition of a good bartender, and set a second cup of coffee in front of Emma, who thanked him with a smile that was genuine. She and Noah Monroe sat across the table from each other in the warm, still air of the Silver Bell Saloon, and there was a moment of silence that was not uncomfortable precisely, but that had weight to it, the weight of two people sizing up a situation and deciding what to do with it. Then Noah Monroe asked her something. He did not know where it came from. He had not, as he said later and as was the plain truth, asked a question that mattered in years. He had asked Walt about trouble and asked Pete about fences and asked Mr. Briggs about prices, and he had asked the weather, in the way of all men, with his eyes on the sky every morning, reading it for what the day would bring. But he had not asked a person something real, not since Ruth, not since the particular intimacy of knowing someone had been closed off from him by loss and by the long habit of not seeking it again. But this woman had sat down at his table and introduced herself with a composure that was clearly costing her something, and she had the eyes of someone who had been through difficulty and was still going, and something in him that had been quiet for a very long time made a sound, not loud, just a small sound, like a door moving slightly in a breeze, and he said, "What brought you to Caldwell?" It was a question that mattered. She felt it the same way you feel the temperature drop before a storm, something in the air changing. It was not a polite question, the kind you ask to fill space. He asked it the way you ask something when you actually want to know, when the answer matters to you in a way you cannot quite explain. She looked at him across the table and she told him the truth. "I had a life in Missouri," she said. "A husband. His name was Thomas. He died 3 years ago. Pneumonia in the winter of 1879. She said it steadily, the way you say something you have had years to practice saying. "We did not have children. After he died, I stayed in St. Joseph, because I thought staying was what you did. I stayed and I worked and I took care of his mother for 18 months until she also died, and then I looked around at the life I had made out of staying and I realized it did not fit me anymore." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "It fit the person I was before Thomas died. I'm not that person now, so I left." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Where were you going?" "I was not certain," she said. "I had heard there was work in the cattle towns. I thought a place that was still becoming itself might be easier to fit into than a place that had already decided what it was." Another question came out of him, quiet and direct and genuine. "And does it fit?" She considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. "Not yet," she said, "but I think it might." He nodded slowly. And then, because she had told him something true, he told her something true in return, the way honesty works between people who are paying attention. "My wife died in 1878, he said. "Ruth, winter fever. It was fast." He said this with the flatness of someone who has edited the pain out of a sentence so many times that the editing is complete. "I have the ranch. Cattle, a hired hand named Pete Vasquez, who is a good worker and a quiet companion." He paused. "I come here because the house gets loud when it is empty." Emma looked at him without flinching. "I understand that exactly," she said. And something happened in that moment that neither of them would be able to describe precisely afterward, only that they both felt it. A small unlocking, a door swinging open that had been closed for a long time, and the air coming through from the other side was cooler and better than the air they had been breathing. They talked for 2 hours. It was not 2 hours of revelations and confessions. It was more ordinary than that, and consequently more powerful. They talked about cattle prices and about Missouri, and about the particular difficulties of Caldwell's summer heat, and about whether the church that sat between the saloons was a comfort or an irony. He told her about Pete Vasquez, who was from a family that had been in Texas since before Texas was Texas, and who made the best coffee Noah had ever tasted, better even than Walt's, though Noah kept his voice down when he said this. She told him about Mr. Briggs, who was anxious and difficult but who had, she had recently discovered, a fondness for his own cat that he tried to conceal and that Emma found endearing. Noah asked her what the cat's name was. She said she did not know. Briggs called it only Cat, which she felt was a missed opportunity. Noah Monroe laughed. It was a short laugh, a startled one, the kind that escapes before you can decide whether to allow it, and it transformed his face entirely, the seriousness breaking open to show something younger and warmer underneath. And Emma Whitaker felt the bottom of her careful, managed world shift several inches. She made herself look at her coffee cup instead of at him. When she left the Silver Bell that evening, the heat had gone out of the day, and the sky over Caldwell was the color of peach skin, and she walked back to Mrs. Calloway's, feeling something she had not felt in long enough that she did not immediately recognize it. She had felt seen, not in the frightening way of being watched, in the good way, in the way where another person looks at you and the looking itself says, "I think you are worth looking at." She did not say anything about it to Miss Potts at supper, who was talking about her students again with that hopeless devotion. She did not say anything to Clara, who had received a letter from her husband in Texas, and was reading it with an expression that suggested the business in Texas was not going particularly well. Emma ate her supper and contributed to the conversation, and went to bed and lay in the dark, thinking about a man who laughed like he had forgotten he could. He thought about her too. He rode the 10 miles back to his ranch in the cool of the evening with the stars coming out over the Kansas plains, and Pete was at the bunkhouse, and the ranch house was quiet the way it always was, and he stood on the porch for a long time looking at the dark and thinking about a woman who had sat down at his table without asking permission, and told him the truth without flinching, and had said, when he asked what brought her to Caldwell, that she was looking for a place that was still becoming itself. He had asked her everything, or close to it. He had asked where she was going, whether the place fit her, what the cat's name was, whether she thought the church between the saloons was a comfort or an irony. She had said a comfort because she had been raised Presbyterian and believed in comfort wherever it presented itself. He had said an irony because he had been raised nothing in particular and had grown up skeptical of institutions, but he said it without bitterness, only as a statement of where he stood, and she had said she respected a man who knew where he stood even if she stood somewhere different. He thought about the way she had looked at him when he laughed, like she had been expecting something good to be in there and was glad to have found it. He went inside and lit the lamp on the kitchen table and sat down, and did not pick up any of the things a man usually picks up to avoid thinking: the newspaper, the horse catalogs, the outdated copies of the Caldwell commercial that had been stacking up on the windowsill, because he could not quite bring himself to throw them away. He just sat and thought about Emma Whitaker, and it felt, against all expectation, less like trouble and more like something beginning. On Friday morning he found a reason to go into Caldwell. This was not entirely unusual. He went into Caldwell 2 or 3 times a week for various legitimate reasons, but this particular Friday the reasons were thinner than usual. He told Pete he needed to pick up salt blocks and check on a feed order, which was true but not urgent, and Pete gave him the look that Pete occasionally gave him, an entirely neutral look that somehow communicated volumes, and Noah pretended not to notice it. He picked up the salt blocks. He checked on the feed order, which had come in and was ready for pickup. He stopped at the Silver Bell, not because he expected Emma to be there at 10 in the morning, but because Walt had good coffee and he needed to think. He was on his second cup when Emma walked in. She walked in the front door carrying a leather-bound ledger and wearing a blue dress the color of a morning sky before the heat came into it, and she was clearly on her way somewhere else and had come in only because she had seen him through the window, which was the same window through which she had first seen him, and he found this fact, when she told him, genuinely pleasing. "I am on my way to Mr. Briggs," she said, standing at his table. "I found an error in the accounts from 1881 that he is not going to be happy about." "Will you sit down?" he said. He asked it. He had thought about it for 1 second and then asked it, directly and genuinely, without the slight formal awkwardness of the day before. He asked it the way you ask something when you want the answer to be yes. She sat down. "What sort of error?" he asked. She explained it to him in a way that was precise and slightly entertaining, because Emma Whitaker had the kind of mind that could find the interesting shape in a problem even when the problem was just arithmetic. And she had discovered that Briggs's previous bookkeeper had been recording certain deliveries twice, either through carelessness or through the kind of quiet dishonesty that is always presented as carelessness when discovered. And the result was that Briggs believed he had $20 more in outstanding debt than he actually had. This was good news for Briggs, which was why Emma could not entirely explain why she was dreading telling him. "Because good news delivered to an anxious man," Noah said slowly, working it out, "often just creates a new anxiety about why it was bad news before." She pointed at him. "Exactly." He felt the warmth of being understood in the precise and specific way move through him like sunlight through glass. He had not felt that in a long time either. They had coffee and talked for 30 minutes, and then Emma went to deliver good news to Mr. Briggs, and Noah went to load his salt blocks into his wagon, and when he passed the general store on his way out of town, she was visible through the window, standing across the counter from Briggs, and gesturing at the ledger with an expression of patient persistence that he recognized as the particular expression of someone who is right and knows it, and is determined not to be unkind about being right. He found himself smiling the whole 10 miles home. This continued. They met at the Silver Bell on Thursday afternoons, which became their established thing without any explicit agreement, just the accumulation of the same choice made repeatedly. Sometimes they met other mornings or other afternoons when he had reason to come into town, and she had a break in her work, and they would find each other at the Silver Bell, or sometimes on the bench outside the general store, or occasionally taking a slow walk along the main street in the cooling evening. He asked her questions. He could not seem to stop asking her questions now that he had started. He asked her about Missouri, about what St. Joseph had been like before the railroads made it a jumping-off point for half the country, about her parents, who were still living, and who wrote her letters that she read and reread until the paper softened. He asked her about Thomas, her late husband, with the careful respect of a man who understood what it cost to talk about someone you had lost, and she told him about Thomas, who had been a good man and a fair husband, and who had loved her in a solid, steady way that she had valued and still valued in memory, who had been a carpenter, and who had made her a rocking chair for their first anniversary that she had left behind when she came west because it was too large to bring, and because sometimes the things you love most are the ones you have to leave. He told her about Ruth, carefully and truthfully, the way he had not talked about Ruth since the first year after she died when people still asked, and he had not yet learned to deflect. Ruth had been from Ohio originally, had come west with her family as a child, had grown up in Wichita and met Noah at a cattle fair in the spring of 1875. She had been quick-tempered and funny and completely unafraid of hard work, and she had been trying to make curtains for the ranch house windows when she got sick, and the curtains were still folded in the cedar chest in the bedroom because he had never been able to make himself put them up, and had also never been able to make himself throw them away. Emma was quiet for a moment after he told her about the curtains. Then she said, "Would you like me to put them up?" He looked at her. The question had a weight to it, she knew that. He could see that she knew it. "Not yet," he said. "But maybe," she nodded. She did not push it and she did not back away from it. She simply accepted that some things took time and that time was something they had. August came to Caldwell with a ferocity that drove even the cattle drovers to seek shade during the middle of the day, and the town operated in two registers, quiet in the noon heat and busy in the evenings when the temperature dropped enough for movement. Emma's work at Briggs's store had expanded beyond just the accounts. He had begun to rely on her judgment in ways he would not acknowledge out loud but that were evident in how often he asked her opinion, always framed as observation, never as request, because Briggs was a man who needed to believe he was deciding everything himself, and Emma had long since made her peace with that. She had also, on 3 evenings a week, begun going over the accounts for the Caldwell Commercial, the local newspaper, whose editor, an energetic man named Franklin Hayes who wore his ink stains like medals, had heard about her work with Briggs and come to ask for help with cheerful shamelessness. She found she liked Franklin Hayes and the hum of the newspaper office, the smell of ink and paper, and the constant productive noise of a place that was every week making a record of a place becoming itself. She was, she realized, becoming useful in Caldwell, not just employed but woven in. People recognized her on the main street and called her by name. Mrs. Calloway had begun asking her to stay for supper as a matter of course rather than invitation, which was the highest form of acceptance Mrs. Calloway offered. Miss Potts asked her advice about her more difficult students. Clara, whose husband in Texas had evidently resolved his business and come home to Wellington, had moved out of the boarding house, and her room had been taken by a newly arrived schoolteacher who was young and homesick, and whom Emma took under her wing with the natural authority of someone who had recently been homesick herself and had survived it. And Noah Monroe came to town on Thursdays and sat across from her at the corner table of the Silver Bell, and asked her things, and told her things, and the air between them grew warm with the particular warmth that is not temperature but feeling. One Thursday in mid-August he arrived at the saloon before her, and when she came in he had, without ceremony or announcement, brought a small bunch of wildflowers from his property and placed them in a glass of water in the middle of the table. They were yellow flowers, prairie sunflowers and goldenrod, the late summer flowers of the Kansas grasslands, and they were slightly crooked in the glass, and completely without sophistication, and Emma looked at them for a full 5 seconds before she sat down. "I pass a good many of them on the ride in," he said, as if they were already in the middle of a conversation about the flowers. "Seemed a waste not to bring some." "It does not seem wasteful at all," she said. They looked at the flowers together for a moment. Then she looked at him. "Noah," she said. It was the first time she had said his name directly to him without it being the beginning of a sentence about something else, and they both registered this, the particular significance of a name said plainly as the entirety of what is meant. "Emma," he said. There was a long moment in which the Silver Bell, with its card players and its tobacco smell and Walt washing glasses behind the bar, and the summer light coming through the front window at an angle that turned the dust in the air to gold, existed around them like a painting exists around the thing at its center. "I think you know what I would like to say," he said. "I think I do," she said. "I am not a man who says things well," he said. "I want to tell you that plainly so you know I am not holding back eloquence I have. I genuinely do not have it. I do not need eloquence," she said. "I need honesty. I think you are the most remarkable person I have spoken to in years," he said. "I think you walked into this town and sat down at my table, and I have not been the same since. And I have been thinking about how to say that, and whether I should say it, and I have decided that I am going to say it because not saying things is something I have done too much of." She felt the familiar, careful structure of her managed, reasonable heart doing something unreasonable. She felt it the way you feel sunlight after a long winter, with the whole of you, with more gratitude than you expected. "I think," she said carefully, "that I have been building a wall for 3 years, and you are the first person who has made me want to stop building it." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. His hand was large and work-roughened and very warm, and she turned her hand over under his and held it. And they sat like that in the Silver Bell Saloon in Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1882, holding hands across a table with yellow wildflowers between them. And neither of them said anything for a while because nothing they might have said would have added to what was already being said. He walked her back to Mrs. Calloway's that evening. They walked slowly, taking the long way around the back of the church even though it added 5 minutes, and the sky was going dark and pink over the flat Kansas plain, and the first stars were appearing, and it was the most beautiful evening either of them had been aware of in years. At the gate of Mrs. Calloway's house he stopped and turned to her, and his face was doing the thing it sometimes did where everything he felt was visible in it, not the guarded face of the Silver Bell corner, but the open face she had begun to see more and more, the face of a man coming back to himself after a long absence. "Would you come out to the ranch on Sunday?" he said. "I would like to show you the place." She said yes. Sunday came with a high blue sky and a little mercy in the wind, and Noah arrived at Mrs. Calloway's with his wagon and a horse tied alongside for Emma to ride if she preferred, because he had not known which she would want and so had provided both. She chose the horse, a calm sorrel mare he called Lady, and they rode out together across the 10 miles of Kansas grassland with the late summer flowers still burning yellow and purple along the track, and the cattle visible in the distance in their slow, deliberate way. The Monroe ranch was not grand. The house was a solid, modest structure, wood frame with a porch that faced west for the sunsets, a barn in decent repair, a bunkhouse where Pete Vasquez lived. There was a kitchen garden that had gone slightly to weeds because Noah had never been much of a gardener and had not made the time, and a cottonwood tree beside the porch that was large enough to have been there longer than the house. Emma dismounted and stood in the yard and looked at all of it with the genuine attention she gave everything, and Pete Vasquez came out of the barn to see to the horses and tipped his hat to her with the reserved courtesy of a man who has watched his employer quietly suffering for 4 years and has opinions about it that he keeps to himself. "Pete," Noah said, "this is Emma Whitaker." "Ma'am," Pete said. "Mr. Vasquez," Emma said. "Noah has told me you make exceptional coffee." Pete looked at Noah with an expression of mild surprise that contained, somewhere underneath, the smallest possible amount of satisfaction, the look of a man who has hoped for something for a while and is watching it begin to arrive. Noah showed her the ranch. He showed her the barn with its good smell of hay and horse, the eastern pasture where his best cattle were, the western pasture that needed the fence rebuilt before winter, a project he and Pete had planned to start in October. He showed her the kitchen garden with its weeds and its defiant late summer tomatoes that were producing despite everything, and she crouched down and picked a handful of them and pronounced them excellent. He showed her the house last. Inside it was clean in the way of a man who is orderly by nature but has nobody to be orderly for, everything in its practical place. Nothing pretty anywhere. The walls bare, the windows without curtains. It was a house that had once been a home and was now a place where a person lived, and the difference was palpable, not in any specific absence you could name but in the general quality of the air. Emma moved through it quietly, touching nothing she was not invited to touch, reading the space with the perception that was simply how she saw the world. She stopped in the bedroom doorway and looked in without entering, and she saw the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, and she looked at it and then looked at Noah, and he said, quietly, "Ruth's curtains." She nodded. They went back to the kitchen, and Pete had somehow, with the silent efficiency of a man who has anticipated a situation, started a pot of coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table, which was where Noah ate every meal alone and which now had the strange and powerful quality of a table with people at it. And they drank Pete's coffee, which was indeed remarkable, and the afternoon light came through the bare windows and lay itself across the table, and everything outside was still and golden. "I love this place," Emma said. He looked at her. "You have only just seen it." "I know. I love it the way you love a thing that has not been given everything it needed," she said. "The way you love something with potential." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been here for 8 years. I built this house myself. I have put more of myself into this ground than I can account for." He looked out the bare window at the cottonwood tree. "I had not said that to anyone, that I love it." "Why not?" "Because for a long time saying it felt like saying something that could be taken away," he said. "And it is easier not to say the things that can be taken." She understood this more completely than she could easily express. She said, "I know, but I think the things that can be taken are usually the same things that are worth having." He looked at her across the kitchen table of the house he had built himself, and the house he had been alone in for 4 years, and he said, "I think you are exactly right." The weeks that followed were the kind of weeks that are ordinary in their events and extraordinary in what they are building. Emma came to the ranch on Sundays and sometimes Saturdays, and Noah came to Caldwell on Thursdays as always, and also on other days, the legitimate reason days that had become less about the reason and more about the destination. They worked alongside each other more than they talked, because they had discovered that they were both people who were comfortable in productive silence, which is a rarer compatibility than most people know. She helped him with the kitchen garden in the afternoons, cutting back the weeds and reshaping the beds for the autumn planting, while Pete and Noah worked on the western fence. She was not there to demonstrate domesticity, and he was not there to watch her demonstrate it. They were simply two people in the same place doing useful things, and the doing of useful things together was, she thought, perhaps the most honest form of courtship she could imagine. September came and the Kansas summer began to moderate, the nights going cool and the mornings carrying that particular autumn quality, clear and slightly sharp, that made the whole world seem more defined. The cattle were fat, and Noah had been planning his autumn drive to the Caldwell stockyards, where he would sell part of his herd to the buyers who came up from Texas and Kansas City, and this was the primary business of his year, the thing that kept the ranch viable and his bank account from hollowing out. Emma came to understand the rhythms of the ranch's financial life with the clarity of a woman who understood accounts, and she understood that Noah Monroe's operation was sound but not comfortable, that a bad year could narrow the margin significantly, and that the western fence needed rebuilding, and the barn needed a new roof section, and the bunkhouse had a draft in winter that Pete endured without complaint, but that Noah felt guilty about. She did not offer to involve herself in his finances. That was not her place, and she knew it. But she listened when he talked about it, and she asked the kinds of questions that helped him think more clearly, which was, she had found, often more useful than advice. One evening in late September, sitting on the porch of the ranch house as the sun went down, and the coyotes started their distant conversation in the grass, Noah said to her, without preamble, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that I have been thinking about it carefully, and that I am asking it because I mean it, and not because I am in the habit of saying things I do not mean." She set down the mending she had been doing, which was Pete's work shirt because she had offered and Pete had accepted with the gratitude of a man who had been managing single-handedly for too long, and she looked at Noah. He was looking at the sunset and his hands were on his knees and he had the expression of a man gathering himself for something important, and she thought, with a catch in her breath that she hoped did not show, that she knew what he was going to say. "Will you marry me?" he said. Not a question exactly, or not only a question. It was also a statement, the statement of a man who has decided something and is laying it before you as both an offer and a fact. She was quiet for long enough that he turned to look at her. She was looking at her hands, then she looked at him. "I am going to ask you something first," she said. "All right." "Are you asking me because you are lonely," she said, "or are you asking me because of me specifically?" He did not hesitate. "Because of you specifically," he said. "Emma, I have been lonely for 4 years. I know what lonely feels like. This is not lonely. This is the opposite of lonely. This is the specific, exact feeling of you." She looked at him for a long time. Outside, the sunset was doing something spectacular, as Kansas sunsets sometimes did, going red and orange all the way across the sky in a display that seemed excessive for ordinary occasions, and was perhaps not, tonight, excessive at all. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath that he had apparently been holding for some time. Then he reached over and took her hand, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat on the porch of the Monroe Ranch in the cool September evening, and watched the sun go down over the Kansas grassland, and it was, by any measure that mattered, one of the finest evenings either of them had ever had. They were married in October. The ceremony was held in the little church between the saloons, which Emma had always maintained was a comfort, and which Noah, on the morning in question, conceded might have merit as a location. And Reverend Albright, who was small and energetic and enthusiastic about marriage in the way of clergymen who have performed too many funerals, was genuinely delighted to conduct it. Mrs. Calloway was there, in her best hat, with an expression of satisfaction that she wore the way other people wore celebrations. Franklin Hayes was there from the Caldwell commercial, and had already written half the announcement in his head. Miss Potts was there, and cried with the generous emotion of a woman who cried at good things as readily as at sad ones. Walt from the Silver Bell was there, in a clean shirt that he had clearly pressed specifically for the occasion. Pete Vasquez stood with Noah in the role of witness, in his best clothes, which were considerably finer than anyone had expected Pete's best clothes to be, and he stood beside Noah with the composed, quiet dignity of a man who has hoped for something for a long time and is watching it arrive. Emma wore her blue dress, the morning sky dress, with a ribbon in her dark hair and the small pearl earrings that had been her mother's, and that she had carried from Missouri in the bottom of her trunk wrapped in a handkerchief. She walked in on her own because there was nobody to walk her in and she needed nobody to walk her in. And when she came down the aisle of that small church in Caldwell between the pews of the people who had become her town in 11 weeks, she looked like a woman who had made a decision with her whole self and was walking toward it at full speed. Noah stood at the front of the church in his best suit, which was considerably improved from his everyday clothes and which showed evidence of Pete's insistence. And when Emma came down the aisle, he looked at her with an expression that Reverend Albright would later describe, to anyone who asked, as the most entirely present face he had ever seen on a groom in 30 years of marrying people. Which was to say that Noah Monroe looked at Emma Whitaker walking toward him, and there was nothing in his face except her. The ceremony was brief and plain and genuine. The vows were the traditional ones, and they said them without flourish, and with the full weight of people who have lost before and know what they are promising. When Reverend Albright declared them married, and Noah kissed his wife for the first time in the small church between the saloons with October light coming through the narrow windows, Walt started clapping, and Mrs. Calloway produced a sound that was half laugh and half sob, and Pete Vasquez stood very still with his hat in his hands and his jaw set, and his eyes, somewhat brighter than usual. After the ceremony, the celebration moved naturally to the Silver Bell, because Walt had both offered his establishment and insisted on it, and he had laid out a table of food that was better than anyone expected and worse than it would have been at a fancier event in a bigger town, and was exactly right for Caldwell in October of 1882. There was music from the piano player who had been playing weekend evenings, a small, wiry man named Cooper who had a gift for reading a room, and played the evening half gentle and half joyful in a way that seemed designed specifically for this occasion. Emma danced with her husband for the first time on the floor of the Silver Bell, which was not the floor anyone would have chosen for a wedding dance, and which was consequently perfect for a wedding that had started at a corner table in the same room. Noah danced with the careful intention of a man who had learned to dance in his youth and not practiced in some time, and Emma danced with the slight suppressed laugh of a woman who finds a man's earnest effort at dancing more endearing than expertise would have been. And they turned slowly on the Silver Bell floor with Cooper playing something old and sweet on the piano, and the warm evening light coming through the same front window Emma had first seen Noah through, from the other side of the glass now, from inside. They drove out to the ranch that night, the two of them in Noah's wagon under the October stars, with Emma's trunk in the back alongside everything she owned, which was not much and was everything. The Kansas plain was wide and dark around them, and the stars were the particular extravagant stars of a place with no city lights to compete with them, and they drove in comfortable silence with Emma's shoulder against Noah's and his arm around her. And the ranch house, when they came to it, had a light in the window because Pete had lit the kitchen lamp before he went to his bunkhouse, which was a kindness of such precise and practical understanding that Emma, when she saw it, felt a warmth toward Pete Vasquez that would remain for the rest of her life. They went inside and Noah hung up his hat and Emma set down her traveling bag and they stood in the kitchen of the ranch house that was now hers too, looking at each other in the lamplight. "I'm going to put up those curtains," Emma said. He looked at her. "Ruth's curtains. They were made for these windows," she said. "They should be in them." She held his gaze steadily. "If you are ready," he thought about it. Not for long, but genuinely, giving it the proper consideration. Then he said, "I am ready." They found the cedar chest and opened it together, and inside, folded with the careful precision of a woman who had made them with care, were Ruth's curtains, cream-colored and neatly hemmed, still good after 4 years in the cedar chest. They hung them that night, the two of them together, Emma holding them up while Noah fixed the rods, and when they were done the bedroom windows that had been bare for 4 years were covered, and the house was a different house, not worse, not better, but different in the way that inhabited things are different from empty ones. Noah stood back and looked at the curtains for a long moment. Then he said quietly and without sadness, "She would have liked you." Emma said just as quietly, "I think I would have liked her." And that was the right thing. Not the forgetting of what had been, but the carrying forward of it into what was. The acknowledgement that love does not cancel previous love but adds to it, makes more room, and that a man who has loved well once is capable of loving well again, and a woman who has grieved honestly is capable of joy again, and neither of these things requires the erasure of what came before. The autumn drive came in October, and Noah sold a portion of his herd at good prices, the buyers from Kansas City having arrived in Caldwell in good numbers and the market being strong, and the money went first to the barn roof, and second to the bunkhouse draft, and third to a new kitchen stove that Emma had identified as the most necessary improvement to the house, because the current one was inconsistent, and she had plans for the kitchen that required reliability. Noah had told her to decide, and she had decided, and the stove arrived from the Caldwell hardware dealer with considerable ceremony, and was installed by Pete with an expression of professional satisfaction at a job well done. Emma continued her work at Briggs's store through October, tapering it down as December approached, because she and Noah had talked about it, and decided that the ranch accounts needed organizing more urgently than Briggs's. And besides, Briggs had found a young woman recently arrived in Caldwell who was competent with figures and needed the work. She continued at the Caldwell commercial because Franklin Hayes begged her to, and because she genuinely liked the work, and because, as she told Noah, 2 days a week of accounts work was not going to keep her from anything, and he agreed. Winter came to Kansas with the particular seriousness that Kansas winters have, not the dramatic ice storms of Missouri or the endless gray of eastern winters, but a cold that meant business. A wind that came straight down from the north with nothing to stop it across the wide flat plain. A cold that got into the seams of buildings and required the constant attention of fires. Emma learned the rhythms of the ranch's winter as she had learned the rhythms of Caldwell, by observation and participation, by asking questions and doing the work. She and Pete developed an alliance based on mutual respect and the shared project of looking after Noah Monroe, who had, they both understood, spent too many years looking after himself without adequate help, and had developed habits of self-sufficiency that occasionally expressed themselves as the refusal to acknowledge difficulties, until the difficulties had become significantly worse than they needed to be. Pete had been managing this phenomenon from the bunkhouse, with limited leverage. Emma managed it from the house, with considerably more. One January morning she came out to the barn while Noah and Pete were working to find Noah's left hand wrapped in a rag, and the rag red, from a wire cut that he had taken while repairing the south fence and had apparently decided was not worth mentioning. Emma looked at the rag, then she looked at Noah. "How long ago?" she said. "This morning," he said. "And you were going to tell me when." "It is not serious," he said. "Noah," she said, in the tone she had developed for this particular category of conversation. Pete, to his great credit, found something necessary to do at the other end of the barn at this exact moment. She cleaned and bandaged the wound with the competence of a woman who had nursed a sick husband and a dying mother-in-law and knew what she was doing, and she was gentle about it and stern about it at the same time, and Noah sat on the barn stool and let her tend to him with the expression of a man who is slightly sheepish and deeply grateful. "You are not alone anymore," she said, tying off the bandage. "You can stop pretending to be." "I am not pretending," he said. "You are a little bit pretending," she said. "It is a habit. I understand why you have it. I have it too, but we agreed to stop." He looked down at his bandaged hand and then up at her face, and he said, "You are the best thing that has happened to me in my adult life." She stood up and put her hands on either side of his face and kissed him, once firmly, in the barn with the horses watching and Pete carefully invisible at the far end, and then she picked up her kit and said, "I know. Now come inside for breakfast before it gets cold." Spring arrived in 1883 with the specific announcement of spring on the Kansas plain, a greening so fast it seemed to happen between glances, the brown dead grass replaced in days by new growth, wildflowers appearing in the fields as if remembering themselves, and the cattle, newly energetic, requiring more attention across the new grass. Emma's kitchen garden came to life under her management, in ways it had not managed in several years, with the early peas coming up in neat rows, and the tomatoes started in the kitchen window for later transplanting, and the beans and squash planned out in beds that had been rebuilt from their weedy September state. She wrote long letters to her parents in Missouri, describing the ranch and the town and her husband with the enthusiasm of a person who has found the right thing. Her parents wrote back with the careful joy of people who had worried about their daughter for 3 years and were allowing themselves to stop worrying by degrees. Her mother asked about grandchildren with the transparent restraint of a woman who desperately wanted to ask about grandchildren and was trying to be patient about it. In May of 1883, Emma told Noah she was expecting. They were in the kitchen after supper, and she had been sitting with it for 3 days, being certain before she said it. And when she said it, the expression that moved across Noah Monroe's face was the most complicated thing she had ever seen on a person, all the feelings arriving at once, joy and fear and wonder and grief and love and gratitude, all of them real, none of them canceling the others. He came around the table and held her for a long time, and neither of them said anything. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright, and his jaw was set in the way it's set when he was feeling a great deal and was determined not to embarrass himself about it. And he said, "Are you well?" "How are you feeling?" She said she felt well. She felt the particular tiredness of early pregnancy, and she had been slightly nauseated in the mornings, but she felt fundamentally well, which was the truth. "I am going to take extremely good care of you," he said, with the absolute conviction of a man making a genuine promise. "I will allow that," she said, "within reason." "What constitutes reason?" "I am not ill," she said. "I am expecting. There is a difference, and I would like us both to maintain it." He agreed to this because Emma's terms were reasonable, and because he could see the precise logical distinction she was drawing, and also because he had learned in 8 months of marriage that Emma Whitaker Monroe was right about the majority of things, and that disagreeing with her without an equally logical counterargument was an exercise in mild futility. Pete Vasquez received the news with a handshake for Noah and a respectful nod to Emma, and then went back to his work with the satisfaction of a man for whom things have resolved properly. And the ranch entered the spring and summer of 1883 with the particular additional energy of a place that is becoming more than itself. The summer was good to them. The cattle were healthy, the grass was strong, the summer storms that rolled across the Kansas plain gave enough rain without the kind of biblical flooding that could destroy a crop year. Emma continued her twice-a-week work at the Caldwell commercial well into the autumn, when Franklin Hayes finally, reluctantly, acknowledged that she perhaps needed to reduce her obligations, and she acknowledged this with more grace than she felt because she had liked the work and would miss it. She did not miss it as much as she expected, because the ranch in autumn was its own full world, and she and Noah spent the evenings on the porch in the last of the warm weather and the cool evenings after, and he asked her things, and she told him things, and she asked him things, and he told her things. And the long, quiet question-asking conversation that had started at a corner table in the Silver Bell had simply never stopped. One evening in September, sitting on the porch with the last light going purple over the grass, Emma said, "I think about where I was 2 years ago." "Missouri," Noah said. "The morning I left," she said. "I was standing in the house I had shared with Thomas, and I thought, I do not know what I am going toward. I only know I cannot stay." She paused. "I could not have imagined this." "Is that good or bad?" he said. The question was light, but he meant it. "It is very, very good," she said. He reached over and covered her hand with his, as he had done at the Silver Bell table more than a year ago now, and she turned her hand over and held it, and the prairie was warm and enormous around them, and the first stars were appearing. And Emma Monroe, who had been Emma Whitaker, and who had built herself new from loss on the flat red ground of a cattle town in Kansas, was completely, unreservedly happy. Their son was born in February of 1884. The labor was hard and long, which was the truth of such things, and Dr. Hensley from Caldwell came out to the ranch in the sharp February cold, and Noah spent the night in a state of controlled, walking terror that Pete managed by keeping him supplied with coffee and occasional straightforward statements like, "Women have babies, Noah. It is what happens," which was not poetic but which Noah later said had been precisely what he needed to hear. The boy arrived in the early morning, and Dr. Hensley declared him healthy with the professional satisfaction of a man who has delivered a great many babies and never quite lost his appreciation for the moment. And Noah was allowed in, and he stood at the side of the bed looking at Emma, who was exhausted and brilliant, and the small red creature in her arms, who was emphatically announcing his own existence, and he could not speak for a moment. Emma looked up at him with the profound tiredness and profound joy that live so close together at certain moments that they are barely distinguishable, and said, "He has your jaw." Noah sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at his son. The small face was crumpled and emphatic and entirely new, and Noah put his finger into the baby's hand, and the baby held it with the unconscious, instinctive grip that is perhaps the most astonishing thing a human hand can do. "What do you want to call him?" Emma said. He thought about it for a moment. They had discussed names but had not landed on one. "James," he said. "James Monroe." He looked at her. "My father's name, if you agree." "I agree," she said. James Monroe came into the world on a cold February morning on a ranch 10 miles south of Caldwell, Kansas, in 1884. And the ranch house that had been too quiet for too long was never quiet in the same way again. He was loud and curious and interested in everything from the beginning, which Emma took to mean he had inherited her disposition. And he was also profoundly, comfortably content in the physical company of his parents, particularly his father, who he showed a preference for lying on as a means of sleeping that Noah Monroe submitted to with the helpless delight of a man who has discovered that fatherhood was the specific missing thing he had not known to look for. Pete Vasquez became effectively James's additional guardian, a fact that simply established itself without ceremony over the first months of the boy's life, and Pete could be found most evenings holding the baby with the focused competence of a man applying a skilled trade, while Emma got 2 hours of uninterrupted sleep, and Noah caught up on whatever piece of ranch business had been neglected by the miracle of having a new person in the house. Spring of 1884 brought the greening of the second season Emma had spent on the Monroe Ranch, and it brought a letter from her mother saying that her parents would like very much to come visit, if the offer extended to Missouri relations, and Emma wrote back immediately that the offer absolutely extended and that they were expected in June. They came in June, Emma's parents, Walter and Margaret Whitaker, who arrived in Caldwell on the afternoon train from Wichita with the slightly stunned expressions of people who have traveled from one kind of place to a very different kind of place and are taking a moment to recalibrate. Emma met them at the station, and Margaret Whitaker held her daughter for a long time, and Walter shook Noah's hand with the grip of a man who has been waiting to properly thank someone. James, who was 4 months old and in possession of strong opinions about everything, regarded his maternal grandparents with the serious evaluating expression he used for all new people, and then, apparently reaching a satisfactory conclusion, produced a smile of such immediate and complete charm that Margaret sat down on the nearest bench and pressed her handkerchief to her eyes and said, "Oh, he is just exactly right," which was a thorough review. Walter Whitaker walked the Monroe Ranch with Noah on the first morning, the two of them going out in the early light while Emma stayed at the house with her mother and the baby, and they walked the fence lines and the pastures and talked about cattle and about the Kansas climate and about the plans for the ranch. And Walter was a man who had worked with his hands all his life and who could read land the way Emma could read accounts. And by the end of the walk he said to Noah, "You have built something good here." "We have built something good," Noah said and meant it. Walter stayed for 2 weeks, and by the time he and Margaret left, it was with the clear-eyed understanding that their daughter had made the right choice, that the life she had built for herself in the particular way she had built it, by walking alone into a town that was becoming itself, by sitting down at a stranger's table, by asking and being asked and answering honestly, was a life that fit. Margaret hugged Emma for a long time before the wagon came. She held James and sang to him quietly in the way of grandmothers, the specific songs that survive all generations, and James looked at her with the focused attention he gave music. "You are happy," Margaret said to Emma. Not a question. "I'm very happy," Emma said. "Good," Margaret said. "That is all I ever needed to know." The summer of 1884 settled over the Monroe Ranch with the heat and the productivity of a good year. The herd was growing. Noah had taken on a second hand, a young man named Dylan from Texas who was 20 years old and energetic and slightly in awe of Pete Vasquez, which Pete took with the equanimity of a man who is accustomed to being right and does not feel the need to be demonstrative about it. The barn had been fully re-roofed and the bunkhouse insulated properly, and the kitchen garden was producing with a thoroughness that required more canning than Emma had planned for, which was fine because she found canning satisfying in the particular way that preservation work is satisfying, the putting up of good things against the coming cold. Noah asked her on a Thursday evening in August, when James was asleep and the day's work was done, and they were sitting on the porch with the familiar intimacy of people who have made a habit of the same chair, the same evening, the same each other. He asked her, "Are you glad you sat down at that table?" She looked at him with the look she had sometimes, the direct, fully present look that said she was going to tell him the exact truth. "I sat down at that table," she said, "because I looked through that window and I saw a man who looked like he had forgotten something important, and I thought someone should remind him." She paused. "I was not expecting to be the person who needed reminding too." "What did you need reminding of?" he said. "That I was still here," she said. "That I was still worth asking about. That there was still someone in the world who would want to know the answer to a question about me." She looked at James's sleeping form, dimly visible through the window. "You asked me what brought me to Caldwell. I had not been asked something that mattered in 3 years either." He reached over and took her hand. "I am going to keep asking," he said. "I know," she said. "I am counting on it." The years settled into themselves with the gentle permanence of things that are right. The Monroe Ranch grew steadily, not spectacularly, but with the solid, reliable growth of a place well tended and well loved. Pete Vasquez stayed, as they had always known he would, because the Monroe Ranch had become his home too in the particular way that certain places claim certain people. And as James grew old enough to follow Pete around the barn with focused toddler intensity, Pete bore this attention with the solemn patience of a man who has unexpectedly been given an apprentice and is taking the responsibility seriously. James Monroe grew into a boy of strong opinion and great curiosity, and his mother's eyes and his father's jaw, exactly as Emma had predicted. And he took to ranch life with the enthusiasm of a child who has been raised in it and cannot imagine any other kind. He learned to ride at 3, sitting in front of Noah on a calm horse, and demanded his own horse at 4 in terms that Noah described as negotiations and Emma described as demands, and that both of them found completely charming even while holding the line. In the spring of 1886, when James was 2 years old and strong, Emma told Noah she was expecting again. This time, the news arrived with less of the complex weight of the first time, and more of the direct, pure joy of people who have done this once and know the shape of it, the difficulty and the wonder, and are ready for both. Noah held her hands across the kitchen table and smiled the full open smile that she had first seen break through his seriousness in the Silver Bell, and that remained, 3 years later, her favorite thing about his face. "2," he said. "At least," she said, and he laughed. The pregnancy was easier than the first, which Emma attributed to being stronger and more settled in herself, and she continued to work with Franklin Hayes at the Caldwell commercial until the late autumn, when he released her with exaggerated regret, and she promised to return in the new year. The second child arrived in January of 1887, a girl this time, healthy and demanding, and Noah held her in the gray January light of the ranch house bedroom and looked at his daughter with an expression that Emma stored in the part of herself that kept the most precious things. "Clara," Emma said, "after the seamstress from Mrs. Calloway's, I always liked her." "Clara," Noah agreed. "Clara Ruth Monroe." Emma looked at him. "Ruth deserves to be remembered," he said simply. Emma felt the warmth of it, the rightness of it, a life honored not by being sealed away but by being carried forward, given to new life as a name, a legacy, a small permanent piece of the continuing world. She reached up and touched his face. "Yes," she said, "Clara Ruth Monroe." Clara announced herself to Caldwell with a thoroughness that James had matched at his loudest, and that the entire Monroe household, Pete and Dylan included, adapted to with the cheerful resignation of people who have added something chaotic and beautiful to their lives. The spring of 1887 brought green to the Kansas plain, and the Monroe kitchen garden, and the good news that the fence Pete and Noah had been rebuilding piece by piece over 3 winters was at last complete, the entire perimeter solid, a thing Noah stood before one April morning and looked at with the satisfaction of finished work. Emma came to stand beside him and look at it too, and James stood between them holding his father's hand, and Clara was in Emma's arms, 4 months old and looking at the sky with the interested expression she had already established as her characteristic response to the world. "Good fence," Emma said. "Good fence," Noah agreed. "What are we looking at?" James said. "The fence," Noah said. "We built it." "It is a fence," James said, with the practical assessment of a 4-year-old who does not yet understand the satisfaction of completed work but will. "Yes," Emma said. "One day you will understand why we are proud of a fence." "Why?" James said. "Because we built it," Noah said, "together." James considered this for a moment with the seriousness he brought to things he was working out. Then he said, "Okay," and returned his attention to a beetle he had found in the grass at his feet, because he was 4 and there was a beetle, and that was more interesting than a fence. And both Noah and Emma found this so completely and perfectly reasonable that they both laughed. The town of Caldwell continued to grow around them in the way of cattle towns in those years, acquiring new businesses and new residents and new complications as the cattle drives continued, and the railroads extended, and the territory of Kansas pressed itself further into permanence. Mrs. Calloway continued to run the boarding house and to approve of Emma Monroe with the satisfied expression of a woman who considers herself a good judge of people and has been vindicated. Franklin Hayes continued to publish the Caldwell commercial with energy and ink-stained hands, and continued to rely on Emma's twice-a-week accounting help. And by 1887, he had taken on an actual reporting staff of 2 young men who wrote with more enthusiasm than accuracy, and who Emma occasionally, diplomatically, helped to improve. Walt at the Silver Bell retired in the late autumn of 1887, handing the establishment to a younger man named Curtis who had learned the trade at Walt's elbow and who understood the specific responsibility of running a saloon in a cattle town, the keeping of peace, the knowing of when to pour another and when to gently suggest otherwise. Walt came out to the Monroe Ranch on his last day before leaving for Wichita, where his daughter lived, and he sat at the kitchen table where Emma served him coffee and cake, and he looked around the kitchen with the expression of a man reviewing his best work, since he had after all been the one who provided the table where it all began. "I always thought," Walt said, "that when I put that corner table in, I put it in just right, far enough back to be private, close enough to the window to get some light, a good table for someone to sit and think." "It was a very good table," Emma agreed. "And a good table for someone to sit across from," Walt said, with a glance at Noah that carried 30 years of knowing what it meant to be present at the right moment. Noah shook Walt's hand at the door when he left and held it for a moment and said, "Thank you, for more than you know." Walt said, "I know exactly as much as I need to," and climbed back on his horse and rode toward town in the late afternoon light. And that was the end of that and the continuation of everything else. By the end of 1888, James Monroe was 4 years old and Clara Monroe was almost 2. And the Monroe Ranch had 2 full-time hands and a 3rd seasonal worker at roundup time, and a kitchen garden that Emma had expanded to a proper kitchen operation that supplied not only the ranch house, but a regular contribution to Mrs. Calloway's boarding house table, and an occasional surplus sold at the Caldwell market. The house had been expanded, a 2nd room added to the east side that became the children's room, and the porch had been repaired and extended to run the full length of the south face of the house, so that the evening view of the sunset over the grassland was available from any chair along it. On a September evening in that year, after the children were in bed, and the ranch was quiet with the good quiet of a work day done, Emma and Noah sat on the porch in their customary chairs with the customary coffee and the customary sunset going pink and gold over the plain, and Emma said, Do you remember the first question you asked me? He thought about it for a moment. What brought you to Caldwell? He said. Yes, she held her coffee cup with both hands. I have been thinking about the answer, the true answer, not the one I gave you then. He looked at her, attentive. I told you I came because I was looking for a place that was still becoming itself, she said, which was true, but the deeper truth is that I came because I was still becoming myself, and I needed to be somewhere that would let me do that. She paused. A place that was still open, still possible. And was it? He said. It was more than that, she said. It gave me something I did not know I needed. What was that? She looked at him in the September evening light, this man who had sat alone in corners for 4 years and forgotten how to ask questions that mattered, and who had asked her everything, who had been asking her everything ever since, who had never stopped, who she did not believe would ever stop, and she said, someone who wanted to know. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you gave me the same thing. I know, she said. That is why I sat down. He reached over and took her hand as he had done at every version of this moment since the first one, at the corner table of the Silver Bell, on the porch of the ranch in September of 1882, at the kitchen table when he asked her to marry him, at the side of a bed when their children came into the world, at every ordinary and extraordinary moment in between. And she held it, turned her palm up and held it. And the prairie was enormous and golden around them, and the first stars appeared one at a time in the darkening sky above the Kansas plain, and the children were asleep in the house behind them, and Pete Vasquez had a fire going in the bunkhouse, and somewhere to the south in the grassland, the coyotes were beginning their evening conversation, and everything was resolved, and everything was right, and everything was exactly, precisely, specifically what it was supposed to be. The years continued, as years do, and each one added to what they had built together. James grew into a boy of unusual steadiness and great curiosity, going to the Caldwell school where a new teacher, younger than Miss Potts and nearly as devoted, called him one of her most promising students and meant it. Clara grew into a girl of formidable will and considerable charm, who had figured out by the age of 3 that her mother's determined composure and her father's patient depth were both available to her as tools, and had been deploying both with strategic intelligence ever since. There was a third child, a boy named Thomas Walter Monroe, born in the spring of 1890, named for Emma's late husband with Noah's full and unhesitating agreement, because Emma had loved Thomas Whitaker honestly, and he deserved to be remembered, and named also for Emma's father. And Thomas arrived into the world with the calm certainty of a third child who has found everything already in order and settled in accordingly. The Monroe Ranch by 1890 was a solid, real, living thing. 160 acres that had grown to include a neighboring parcel Noah had purchased when it came available, and a herd of good cattle and a well and a barn and a bunkhouse, and a house with curtains in the windows and a kitchen garden and a porch from which the sunset could be properly observed, and 3 children and a hired man named Pete Vasquez who had been there since before any of it was right, and who was not going anywhere. Emma Monroe, who had been Emma Whitaker, who had stood in the middle of Caldwell's Main Street in the burning summer of 1882 with a single trunk, and a set of creekwater eyes and the absolute determination to build something that fit her, had built it. Not the life she had planned, not the life she had grieved, not the life she had fled, but the life she had walked toward without knowing exactly where she was going, and it was more than she had been able to imagine and exactly what she needed and entirely hers, entirely theirs. On a morning in the autumn of 1890, she woke before Noah and went to the kitchen and made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window with the cup warming her hands, looking out at the Monroe Ranch in the gray early light, the barn solid and familiar, the kitchen garden brown and harvested and put to bed for the winter, the cottonwood by the porch going gold, the grassland beyond rolling away to the horizon in every direction, flat and enormous and real. She heard Noah's footstep in the hallway, and he came into the kitchen and stopped to look at her standing at the window, and she turned to look at him, and they regarded each other in the simple, ordinary, extraordinary morning light of a day that was beginning like every day, with the two of them in the same kitchen, in the same ranch house, in the same life. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. She poured him coffee, and he came to stand beside her at the window, and they looked out at the ranch together, at the specific shape of everything they had made out of loss and hope, and the particular courage of two people who had been alone long enough to know the value of the opposite. And the morning came up gold over the Kansas plain, and James could be heard stirring in the children's room, and Clara's decisive footstep followed, and the youngest, Thomas, would be awake soon too, demanding breakfast in the cheerful, insistent way he had, and the day was about to begin, the full, real, complicated, beautiful day that was their life, and Emma Monroe leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they stood at the window of the house he had built and she had made into a home, watching the morning arrive. Everything was asked and answered. Everything was resolved. Everything was right.